Welcome, everyone. I'm Jonathan Brent. I'm Executive Director of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research that was founded here in Vilnius in 1925, but now is headquartered in New York City. And I would like to begin today's session on the subject of ideologies of hate and hope with some brief introductory remarks. We have an excellent panel, and we are very, very privileged to be having this session in the Seimas with the participation of the Speaker of the Parliament, and we are very grateful for that. One of the implicit themes of today's conference, marking the 80th anniversary of the liquidation of the Vilna ghetto, is that ideas have consequences. One of these ideas, and the principal burden of this conference, is the myth of so-called Judeo-Bolshevism, which has bedeviled Jewish relations with so many of the European nations since the beginning of the 20th century, and is still very much alive, as many of us know, in today's world. It was a lethal element in German, Ukrainian, Polish, Lithuanian attitudes during the time of the Shoah, as well as in many other nations. And it impelled many to participate in the murder of Jews, particularly the Jews of Lithuania, with the idea that by doing so, their nations could be saved. Alas, the extermination of the Jews did not bring salvation or redemption. It brought destruction, inhuman pain, a tearing apart of the human world. Yet the question of Jewish Bolshevik leadership and the slander that Jews were, and may still be, Bolsheviks persists and continues to inspire anti-Semitic outrages around the world. It is therefore with special gratitude and appreciation that I recognize the importance of the fact that this conference is taking place in the Lithuanian Seimas, with the support of the Speaker of the Parliament, Victoria Čmilytė-Nielsen, and that of others in the Lithuanian government, supporting the open and many-sided discussion of this difficult topic requires openness, but also courage and the conviction to uncover historical truth in an atmosphere not always conducive to such inquiry. I am grateful for the trust and understanding shown today by so many leaders of the Lithuanian government and Lithuanian society many of whom are here, and with whom I have worked for many years in an effort to preserve and rebuild the memory of the Jewish world of Lithuania. This conference is organized by YIVO in partnership with the Lithuanian Jewish community and could not have taken place without the determination by Faina Kukliansky, head of the Lithuanian Jewish community, that it was high time to hold it. I wish also to welcome and thank all who are attending. By virtue of your attendance, you also are supporting the free, open inquiry into one of the darkest and most difficult areas of the Lithuanian and East European past generally. Contemporary mutations of the myth of Judeo-Bolshevism can be felt as far away as Chicago, Illinois, London, or the Middle East today. The myth of Judeo-Bolshevism grew seamlessly together with the spread of the ideas contained in a counterfeit anti-Semitic forgery, known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, about which I will speak more later. These so-called protocols were supposedly set out a discussion among world Jewish leaders at the first Zionist conference in Switzerland in 1897 and were published in 1903. The protocols supposedly documented the blueprint whereby Jews would eventually come to dominate all the nations of the world. As with all myths, it provides a framework for thinking and for understanding experience within which all facts or supposed facts can find their place and their appropriate meaning. And so, inasmuch as this myth that was accepted as truth by so many around the world became a framework for thinking, it therefore led people to assume that when they saw one Jew welcoming a Soviet or one Jew participating in Soviet leadership, it meant that all Jews welcomed Soviets and all Jews participated in Soviet leadership. The protocols, as altering such a framework of thinking, as we all know, is the work not of one book, one speech, one conference, but of generations. The belief that the world was flat and that the earth was the center of the universe required centuries of effort to disprove in the minds of both the uneducated masses and the educated elites alike. Education, research, social leadership, and government policy must all work together to help to dispel a myth that has enabled millions around the world to construct a seemingly logical yet conspiratorial worldview and understanding of history. Today, therefore, is but a little step, but a most profoundly important one in building a truly human and humane world, which I take to be the strategic goal of so many in the Lithuanian government today, and for which I am particularly grateful. It is a step for which I personally, the community of the YIVO institution in New York City, and all those who think seriously about historical truth cannot be anything but profoundly grateful. In closing, I wish to thank all of the participants who will speak today, and Shelley Freeman, Chief of Staff of the YIVO Institute, together with the staff of Faina Kukliansky, who have been instrumental, in fact, essential in making this event possible. Thank you. And now I would like simply to give the floor to the Speaker of the Parliament.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Introductory remarks. Excelencijos ambasadoriai, žydų litvakų bendruomenės pirmininkai.
Excellencies, ambassadors, representatives of the YIVO Institute, Mr. Brint, Mr. Andrew Baker, Faina Kuklansky from the Lithuanian Jewish community in Lithuania, colleagues, members of the Parliament. Let me begin with the words of support and solidarity with all those who have been affected by the terrorist attack on Israel. On behalf of the Seimas of the Republic of Lithuania and myself, allow me to express my sincere condolences to the relatives of the victims, the hostages and their families. Our thoughts and hearts are with you. About a week ago, an act of vandalism was committed in France, which in the face of the latest wave of anti-Semitism in Europe has taken on a certain symbolic significance. In Lesnevan, a small town in Brittany, a memorial plaque to Simone Veil, a French Holocaust survivor, a recognized leader of European feminism, the first directly elected president of the European Parliament in 1979, and the first woman to hold this office was damaged. After Simone Veil's death in 2017, she was honored by the then President of the European Parliament, Antonio Tajani, as the conscience of the European Union, a fighter against anti-Semitism and a defender of women's rights. Simone Veil was undoubtedly among the moral authorities who symbolized a new post-war Europe, aware of the painful mistakes of its past and determined to make a firm commitment to the future. The brutal desecration of her memory is not only an act of vulgar anti-Semitism, it is an assault on the moral values that have shaped Europe we are an integral part of. This is an ominous sign that we are slowly moving towards anti-European aggression, which undermines the values of Western civilization. In an interview, Simone Veil was asked how she proposed to fight hatred and aggression. "You have to have a strong hope," was the answer, which is very closely related to the topic of today's conference. Hope is not an empty belief that something will happen in our absence. Hope is a perspective that is opened by the force of thought and action. I have a strong hope that Lithuania has overcome its painful past and has boldly chosen a future of Western values. I firmly believe that we will always stand with those who create and build rather than those who kill and destroy. I believe that hate speech, anti-Semitism and xenophobia will have no place in our parliament, and that we will certainly do our utmost to ensure that this is the case. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, a renowned theologian, philosopher, author who has met on a regular basis with world leaders and spoken at some of the world's most prestigious forums, has said, "Jews cannot find anti-Semitism alone. The victim cannot cure the crime. The hated cannot cure the hate. It would be the greatest mistake for Jews to believe that they can fight it alone. The only people who can successfully combat anti-Semitism are those active in the cultures that harbor it." I believe that in Lithuania we do have such active and understanding circles, and I have a strong hope that conferences like this will help to broaden and strengthen this circle. I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate you on the forthcoming Hanukkah holiday, which brings together, inspires, and encourages all people of goodwill. Thank you for your attention, and I wish your conference a successful and meaningful work.
The order of the conference today is that following myself, Violetta Davaluta will speak, and then Jochen Helbeck, and after that there will be a coffee break, but before the coffee break there will then be time for some questions and some discussion. And then after the coffee break, the second part of the conference will begin. My talk today is on the subject of Judeo-Bolshevism, the founding myth of modern anti-Semitism. A bewildering array of anti-Semitic acts and declarations confronts Jews today throughout the world. from the Hamas October 7th terrorist attack to the university demonstrations that we see on television, to the offhand comments of the American billionaire Elon Musk and the pronouncements of government officials and journalists around the world. What might the October 7th attack have to do with the founder of Tesla and SpaceX? The eruption of left-wing anti-Israel anti-Semitism on college campuses and the surge of Holocaust denial in Poland over the last decade, or the provocations of Vladimir Putin? And what might all of this have to do with the genocidal slanders against the Jewish people that helped prepare the way to the Holocaust? My talk is an attempt to unravel some of these mystifying connections, often apparently contradictory, such as that Jews can be accused of being communists on the one hand, and at the same time of controlling the world financial markets on the other hand. By tracing the origin and the growth of the international myth known as that of Judeo-Bolshevism, Żyda komuna, as it is known in Poland. I call it the founding myth of modern anti-Semitism because the widely accepted notion that Bolshevism was essentially a Jewish-controlled political movement, along with the forgery of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, has informed anti-Jewish thought and action around the globe from the time of World War I and the Russian Revolution to the present day. Slide number 3. Can I get slide number 3? No, you don't have it? You do have it? You don't have it. That's the Evo building before it was destroyed. Slide number 3 shows what many might never have imagined possible: an Arabic translation of Hitler's Mein Kampf in a kindergarten school used as a base by Hamas terrorists, most recently discovered by the IDF. How did it get there? At roughly the same time that this image from the kindergarten in Gaza appeared, the American billionaire Elon Musk posted a comment supporting the claim that Jews have been collectively responsible for opening the gates to, quote, hordes of non-white minorities that will destroy America, a sentiment that echoes the gunman Robert Bowers, who murdered 11 Jews at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh in 2018. Bowers wrote in one of his blog posts that the Jewish immigration organization HIAS, quote, likes to bring invaders that kill our people, which sounds a great deal like Jews helped bring in the Soviets that destroyed Lithuania. Sentiments that echo those voiced in the 1930s by Polish and Lithuanian anti-Semites that Jews aided and abetted the Soviet Union, and by far-right American white supremacist groups today that chant, "Jews will not replace us." The scholar Paul Hennebrink, in his 2018 book, has traced the origin of Judeo-Bolshevism to the efforts of white Russian generals in Ukraine, seeking to rally Ukrainian peasants to their fight against the Bolsheviks by emphasizing the leadership roles of Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and others, never asking how or why these individuals of Jewish origin came to have these roles or the extent to which these Bolshevik leaders actually represented the Jewish population at large. Facts did not matter because their objective had nothing to do with facts, but with politics. Slide number 4 shows a typical White Army poster from this period in which an ape-like Trotsky, red, of course, climbs out over the Kremlin walls above a mountain of skulls. Hennebrink concludes that this accusation arose wherever threats to national sovereignty existed, but that, quote, according to the most thorough analysis of the electoral data from the 1920s, Jews in Poland were no more communistic than Catholic Poles. National sovereignty was not the explicit issue in the United States at the time of the Polish-Soviet War of 1920, except to the extent that industrial magnates frequently saw the rise of labor unions as a threat to their financial interests, and the influx of Jewish and Italian immigrants as socially destabilizing. The threat of labor unions, often thought to be led by Jewish interests, merged with the perceived threats to white Anglo-Saxon Protestant hegemony in the United States, and led Henry Ford, the creator of Ford Motor Cars, who had purchased the newspaper The Dearborn Independent in 1919, to conduct an all-out war against what he saw as Jewish Bolshevism. At its height in 1926, the Dearborn Independent had a circulation of 900,000 before being shut down as a result of a libel suit in 1927. Hitler read and appreciated Henry Ford and cites Ford's The International Jew in Mein Kampf. In 1938, Hitler awarded Henry Ford the Grand Cross of the German Eagle. The idea that Jews were Bolsheviks and Bolsheviks were Jews quickly merged with the idea of world domination and contained in the protocols, and spread throughout Europe and America as a means of identifying a so-called degenerate ideology with a so-called degenerate race. If ideas could be so branded, it became unnecessary to debate them. It was necessary only to oppose them by opposing Jews. Though Henry Ford concerned himself far more with profits and championing white Anglo-Saxon Protestant mission to rule America than with matters of national sovereignty, these worries were closely connected to questions about the sovereignty of the white race in the United States, which after the Civil War had granted Black Americans equal status under the law. With this arose the Ku Klux Klan, the white supremacist group whose goal was to restore white dominance throughout the American South. And with the rise of the Klan in the late 19th century and early 20th century, the American eugenics movement was born. The eugenics movement was a scientific, quote-unquote, movement that proved scientifically that blacks, Jews, and others were a lesser race and promoted, quote, racial hygiene, forced sterilizations, and anti-immigration policies, quickly modeling those of the Nuremberg laws. The Harvard-educated journalist and political scientist Lothrop Stoddard, who was born in 1883, wrote numerous books advocating the aims of the eugenics movement with weighty titles such as The Revolt Against Civilization, The Menace of the Underman, The Rising Tide of Color Against the White World Supremacy. The rising tide of color against white world supremacy went through 10 printings in the United States and was translated into many European languages. Adolf Hitler read it and admired Stoddard's work, even agreeing to be interviewed by Stoddard in 1939. At the time, Stoddard wrote that Germany's racial laws were, quote, weeding out the worst strains in the Germanic stock in a scientific and truly humanitarian way. As for Jews, Stoddard foresaw the, quote, Jewish problem would be settled by the physical elimination of the Jews themselves from the Third Reich. Stoddard was eventually exposed as a consultant to the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. In the preface to the revolt against civilization, he condemned, quote, the process of racial impoverishment, which destroyed the great civilizations of the past and which threatens to destroy our own. He argued that, quote, in the light of biological discoveries confirmed and amplified by investigations in other fields of science, especially psychology, all political and social problems need to be re-examined. That is, he and fellow eugenicists would follow the facts. In 1939, the Carnegie Foundation, which had supported the eugenics movement since the early 1900s, concluded that these facts had no scientific merit whatsoever and withdrew its funding. But these pseudo-facts, these non-facts, these outright inventions became the backbone of Nazi race science, and the fusion of race theory with Nazi anti-Bolshevism became the blueprint for the genocide of the Jews. Slide number 6. This is a front page from Henry Ford's Dearborn Independent of 1921. This is the cover of Stoddard's book, 1920 book, The Revolt Against Civilization. It was published in the United States by Charles Scribner's Sons, the same firm that published Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, and enjoyed wide readership. Notice the man in spectacles, you see him in the back, with the hooked nose standing in the back of the crowd. Flames appear to soar out of one side of his head, while the red flag of revolution soars out of the other. The ape men in the foreground might be thought to depict African Americans. They do not. In fact, the target of Stoddard's book was not them, but rather Jews and Catholic Italians, who were also thought to pose significant threats to the pure white Anglo-Saxon Protestant hegemony of American society at the time. In 1930, Alfred Rosenberg, Hitler's chief racial theorist, noted in his major work, The Myth of the 20th Century, that this signal Nazi term Untermensch, derived from the title of Stoddard's book, The Revolt Against Civilization, the menace of the underman, the Untermensch, which had been translated into German in 1925. This is the kind of human being that Lothrop Stoddard has called the underman, Rosenberg wrote. Stoddard characterized that, quote, kind of human being as follows. In the first place, the Jewish mind, instinctively analytical and sharpened by the dialectical subtleties of the Talmud, naturally takes to dissective criticism. Jews have played an important part in all social revolutionary movements from the time of Marx and Engels down to the largely Jewish Bolshevist regime in Soviet Russia today. Bolshevism, Stoddard writes, was, quote, frankly out for a world revolution and the destruction of world civilization, Western civilization. More and more, we are coming to see that the hatred of civilization is a matter of heredity, that Bolsheviks are mostly born and not made. That is, Jews equal Bolsheviks, Bolsheviks equal Jews. A lethal syllogism. Bolshevism is a matter of heredity. Bolshevism is out for the destruction of world civilization. Little wonder then that in 1935, a Nazi official laid a ceremonial wreath bearing the swastika in Harvard University Chapel in Cambridge, Massachusetts. According to the scholar Stefan Kurl, there was active professional cooperation between American proponents of eugenics and the Nazi counterparts until the late 1930s. On Monday, February 20th, 1939, 6 months before the beginning of World War II, a, quote, pro-American rally took place in Madison Square Garden in New York City, attended by 20,000 American Nazis. Men, women, boys, and girls, giving the Hitler salute in support of what Fritz Julius Kuhn, the head of the German-American Bund termed a, quote, socially just, white, Gentile-controlled United States that would oppose the, quote, Jewish-controlled press and set itself steadfastly against Jewish Moscow-directed domination. The Pledge of Allegiance was solemnly recited before banners of George Washington, U.S. flags, and swastikas. And the evening concluded with a heavily German accented version of the Star-Spangled Banner. Anyone wishing to see this, there is, in fact, a short video called A Night in a Garden that is the only remaining clip of this event in Madison Square Garden in 1939. The biological basis for anti-Bolshevism that grew out of the work of the American eugenicists became the socially approved justification for genocide. Jews could not but be Bolsheviks. They could not but wish to destroy Western civilization, as we see in the leering, degenerate face of the Jew and the Bolshevik commissar in this next slide. Poster, Nazi wartime poster, which is entitled The Fate of Women Under the Whip of Bolshevism. The poster represents the perfect fusion of race thinking with anti-Bolshevism in Nazi propaganda in Poland in the 1940s. But pause for a moment and consider that this poster was placed at the very end of the exhibition in the Oskar Schindler Museum in Krakow, where I came upon it in 2019. The museum is dedicated to preserving the memory of the actions of a man who saved thousands of Jews from extermination. Yet here, at the end of the exhibition, brought to my attention by a Polish friend, whose hand you see there, this poster represented, without commentary, with no historical context or explanation of any kind, might well remind the casual viewer attending the museum that while Jews were indeed victims, they were also somehow responsible for their fate. A well-known anti-Semitic Holocaust denialist tactic. I would now like to turn to the actual faces of some of these alleged undermen. Hereditary Bolsheviks and destroyers of Western civilization. This is the face of the young Yitzhak Rudashevsky, whom some of you may know from his famous diary of 1941-43, rescued from the Vilna ghetto after the war and donated to the YIVO Institute. This diary, now translated into Lithuanian, is the basis of the next exhibition of the YIVO Online Museum that will appear in early 2024. This is a page of the diary written in Yiddish in the ghetto. I will have more to say about this diary in a moment, but first I would like to note examples of some of the materials this young Rudashevsky might well have encountered in his studies. This is a slide of Homer's Odyssey and Iliad translated into Yiddish in Berlin, Germany, 1924. The next is a Yiddish translation of The Tale of the Dead Princess and the Seven Knights by Pushkin, translated into Yiddish in Warsaw, Poland, 1917. This is the first algebra book published in Vilna in 1929. All these are taken from the YIVO archive. First algebra book published in Yiddish in Vilna. And this is an astronomical diagram created in Vilna in 1835 by a young Jewish scholar hoping to introduce Jews to the modern world. Hardly evidence, one might think, of the inveterate hereditary desire to destroy Western civilization. Far from a Bolshevik, here in slide number 14, we find a Jewish nurse in the Tsarist army. From 1916. Here we see not the evidence of the destruction of Western civilization, but rather an appreciation of hygiene and modern medicine. This is from Warsaw, 1938-39, children being measured and tested. And here we see a hygiene checklist for a student from Poland in 1927. Every day she had to check off what she did, bathe, brush her teeth, comb her hair, etc., etc. It is true that young Rudashevsky sympathized strongly with the Soviet Union and cheered the Red Army's victory at Stalingrad. But this must be set in the context his diary helps us understand. Here he writes in his diary, "I think how helpless we are, separated from one another, exposed to the mercy of the Nazis. Our day is without a future." This is what was burning in the Jewish community. Our day is without a future. I stand at the window and feel a seething sensation in me. My eyes are filled with tears. Our whole helplessness, our whole wretchedness lies out there in the streets. There is no one to defend us, and we ourselves are so helpless, so helpless. Life becomes harder and harder. I feel ashamed to appear with other Jews in the street, not because I am a Jew, but because I am ashamed of what has been done to us. I am ashamed of our helplessness. Ponar, that word is written in blood. Ponar, the huge grave, the green area up the Pahulanke Road, a slaughterhouse for thousands of Jews. The Ponar area is saturated with Jewish blood. Ponar is the same thing as nightmare, a nightmare that has accompanied the gray thread of our ghetto days. Ponar is passive death. The word contains the tragedy of our helplessness. No, we will not go to Ponar, this 14-year-old writes. Despite his brave defiance, like so many others, Yitzhak went to Ponar and was murdered. Yet before his murder, he also recorded page after page of testament in his diary to what today would be termed the power of Jewish cultural resistance. As a Soviet sympathizer, he might naturally have taken part in Marxist discussion groups or in discussions with his friends about the need to destroy Western civilization out of feelings of revenge and to build up a more just, more humane world in its place. But what we find is quite the opposite. He writes, Monday, the 5th of October, 1942, I made it there at last. Today we are going to school. This was an altogether different day. Courses, subjects, both 6 grades have been combined. In school, the mood is happy. Finally, the club has opened. My life is settling in quite a different way. Far less time is being wasted. The Soviets have crossed the Don. People get excited and argue. We are told that the Germans have been unable to take Stalingrad. The classes went by fast. Latin, mathematics, history, Yiddish, then back home, a bite to eat and off to the club. Here we enjoy ourselves a bit. Today there was an inspection led by Yoshinsky. We also watched the club's Meidim puppets performed by 2 boys. It's quite good, though pretty primitive. The literary side is weak, but it doesn't matter if we see creativity. Our youth is at work and is not going under. Our history circle is functioning. We hear lectures about the Great French Revolution and its phases. In the ghetto right now, there are already functioning 3 elementary schools with 3 kindergartens, a technical school, a music school, a high school, a children's home, and an orphanage for abandoned youth. Each of these institutions has behind it a rich history of martyrdom. Yashunsky also spoke about theater and sport in the ghetto. We are creating the following branches of our literary circle: Yiddish poetry, and most important, a group to concern itself with ghetto folklore. I am in charge of the Circle for Creative Original Writing with the poet Sutzkever, and I have to be in constant contact with him. The study period in the morning is quite agreeable, but the rest of the day rushes past quickly. I don't even have time to finish my book from the library. I have a presentation after presentation in Yiddish and history to worry about, and it's all happening at the same time. Every evening as usual, this evening we showed who we are and who and what we can do. The bunch from the club presented songs and declamations. Till late at night we sang along with the adults, songs that tell of youthfulness and hope. We sat at the bare tables and dined on potato pudding and coffee. We were so happy, so happy. Song after song echoed, it's already 12 o'clock. We are as if intoxicated by the joy of youth. No one wants to go home. Songs are bawled out that simply do not want to stop. Late at night we disperse. Today we have proved that we are young, behind walls, but nevertheless young, young forever, is our slogan with which we march toward the sun. Today we have shown that even in these little streets we can maintain our youthful fervor. We have shown that it will not be broken, a broken youth that will emerge from the ghetto. From the ghetto will emerge a strong, hardened, and spirited youth. The desire to study has become a kind of defiance of today, a time that detests studying and loves toil and drudgery. No, I decided I live with tomorrow, not with today. Studying has become the most precious thing to me. Between the recently painted walls, there hovers a feeling of culture and goodness. Our spirit, which we proudly hold high within the walls of the ghetto, will be the finest gift to the future which now arises. Long live youth, the progress of our people. From Yivo, where he, Sutzkever, works, he was able to smuggle in a lot of material for the Yehoash exhibition. This is the work of the Paper Brigade. When you go into the exhibition, you see the youthful energy with which gave full vent to everything. Everything was selected in a beautiful and youthful way. Everything is so cultural and full of warmth. People came in here and forgot they were in the ghetto. We have here in exhibition many valuable documents that now are treasures. Manuscripts sent from Peretz to Yehoash, Yehoash's handwritten letters. We have rare newspaper clippings, translations of the Hebrew Bible in Yiddish from the 17th century. Looking at the exhibition, at our work, your heart fills with pride and enthusiasm, not with Soviet hatred of the bourgeoisie. I would like to conclude this survey with Yitzhak's invocation of pride and enthusiasm and his hope for the future. But unfortunately, his pride, enthusiasm, and hope came face to face with the slander that his belief in culture was nothing more than a will to dominate and oppress. After the war, as Stalin's anti-Semitic, so-called anti-cosmopolitan campaign got started in 1948, culminating in the notorious doctor's plot of 1953, in which Jewish doctors were accused of poisoning Kremlin leaders, yet one more mutation occurred in the virus of this hateful slander that began as Jewish Bolshevism. With the establishment of the State of Israel, vicious anti-Zionist propaganda poured out of the Kremlin into Arab lands. This anti-Zionism took the form of Zionism equals imperialism, Zionism equals racism. Underlying this accusation represents the contemporary consolidation of the protocols of the Elders of Zion with the theme of Judeo-Bolshevism into a single anti-Semitic worldview. Slides 17 and 18 are of a copy of the proven forgery of the 1903 Protocols of the Elders of Zion, published by Ford in 1920 in the Dearborn Independent, in which Jewish leaders purportedly discussed their plot to take over the world. Documents from the KGB archive in Moscow now prove that the protocols was to be used against Jewish doctors in a show trial planned for 1953. The text you see here was purchased in the gift shop of the Russian State Duma in 1993. That's where this was purchased. In slide 18, you see a prefatory word from none other than Henry Ford, from his book, The International Jew. In these simple words of Henry Ford can be heard the accusations of anti-Semites across the globe today that the Jews' quote, cold-blooded plan is to destroy the nations of the world, either through Bolshevism, which by 1948 and certainly by 1993 was no longer feasible, or through other means such as those of Hayes, as the murderer of Robert Bowers alleged, or those of politics and social programs, such as Elon Musk suggests just recently. In slides 19 and 20, we see the final turn of the screw. In the front pages of Russkoye Voskresenie, Russian Resurrection, in which the resurrection of the Russian nation now links the Orthodox Church with Hitler's Nazi anti-Semitism. In other words, the Bolshevism that so alarmed Lothrop Stoddard and Henry Ford has simply become replaced by the protocols as a tool of global Jewish domination, which is why this particular text is so prevalent throughout the Middle East today, and why it now makes complete sense that the core of Nazi genocidal text, Mein Kampf, should be found in a kindergarten in Gaza. Here we see yet another example of the sort of fascist, anti-Semitic propaganda in Russian newspapers in the 1990s. This is from Narodnaya Delo, and there's an ape in the left-hand corner who looks an awful lot like the ape-like Trotsky in that first slide that I showed. Yitzhak Rudashevsky's faith in the power of culture, and then this is the example of Mein Kampf. Yitzhak Rudashevsky's faith in the power of culture to transform the world into a place of warmth, human goodness, can still be embraced today, but only if the culture of cynical hatred that so often appears to encompass the world is fully understood and rejected. Thank you very much. And thank you. Now I would like to ask Jochen Hellbeck to make his presentation. Professor Hellbeck is a professor of history at Rutgers University in New Jersey.
Good morning, everyone. Esteemed Speaker, members of Parliament, dear organizers from the Lithuanian Jewish community, the Polish Institute of Jewish History, and from YIVO, it's an honor to be speaking in the Parliament of the Republic of Lithuania, and I'm very grateful for the invitation. Our gathering today commemorates an exceedingly dark moment in the history of humanity, the 80th anniversary of the annihilation of what was left of Jewish life in Vilnius. This annihilation flowed in large measure from the history of an ideology of hate that is the subject of my presentation. Grasping the lethal charge of ideologies of hate is of utmost importance for historians of the 20th century as much as for citizens of the world today. These ideologies don't go away on their own. They must be forcefully resisted. It is for this reason that my talk dwells on hate and destruction as it does on resistance and hope. My presentation contends that a rising tide of anti-communist hatred in the wake of the First World War endowed a pre-existing hatred against Jews with an annihilatory drive. This hatred, which in Polish-speaking parts of the world gave birth to the battle cry of the Żydų komuna, swept many parts of Europe and the world. Nowhere else, however, was it as consequentially taught and massively applied as in Nazi Germany. The specter of Judeo-Bolshevism was the decisive catalyst of Nazi mass murder. This specter explained the Nazi German fixation on the Soviet Union as the most formidable bastion of the presumed Jewish enemy. And it underwrote Germany's invasion of the USSR in 1941, This invasion marked the inception of the Holocaust. Judeo-Bolshevism is a compound, which I want to approach through its components. Bolshevism, in the Nazi lexicon, stood for the criminality, the Asiatic nature, and the danger of Soviet communist rule. It also spelled all sorts of troubles that, in some sense, it could be aligned with the notion of wokeism today, the gender reversal, women who actually work or actually are trained to shoot rifles, and all sorts of reversals of traditional entrenched hierarchies. Emigres from Russia circulated lurid accounts of leather-clad commissars dispatching thousands of helpless victims by shooting them in the neck. In the words of one such emigre who would rise in the Nazi Party to become Germany's wartime minister for the occupied Eastern Territories, Bolshevism was, quote-unquote, a plague that threatened the West's very survival. Any encounter with Soviet communism knew only two outcomes: annihilation or victory. Hitler consistently portrayed communists who had first assumed power in Russia as his deadliest enemies, believing they had inspired German leftists to stab their country in the back. The Führer's vow to destroy the Red Menace got him Germany's chancellorship in 1933. After locking up more than 100,000 German communists in concentration camps created for this very purpose, the Nazis began to incite Germans against the Soviet state, describing it as an existential threat. Europe against Bolshevism became their most popular rallying cry throughout the 1930s. By the late 1930s, Hitler felt ready to move against the Soviet Union, both to face down the global menace Bolshevism had become and to seize territories in the East that were vital for Germans to fulfill their historical destiny as the world's master race. On August 11, 1939, only days before Nazi Germany would conclude a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, Hitler insisted behind closed doors, "Everything I undertake is directed against Russia. If the West is too stupid and blind to grasp this, then I shall be compelled to come to an agreement with the Russians, beat the West, and then, after their defeat, turn against the Soviet Union with all my forces." Hitler's other great obsession was with the Jews. He was a fierce anti-Semite from early on, but it was only with his embrace of anti-Bolshevik thought after World War I that his hatred of Jews became an ideology. Bolshevism, in his view, evoked the nefarious activities of Jews who had created the Marxist ideology and seized the Kremlin in a bid to then invade Germany and all of Europe. The widespread conviction among the German right that Jewish or Jewish-led communists had masterminded their country's downfall in 1918 gave Hitler's ideas about the Jewish enemy substance and intensity. The Nazis perceived the USSR as the most powerful Jewish organization in the world. They called it World Enemy Number One. The Soviet threat was all-encompassing. As Hitler noted with concern in 1936, the rulers in Moscow propagated, quote, the most extreme variant of the modern Enlightenment faith, which had first provoked the French Revolution and was now sending the world hurtling toward a global showdown. Coded by the Nazis as Jewish, the communist creed of universalism and interracial solidarity clashed with Hitler's project of realizing Germany's imperial racial destiny. Germany had to destroy the Soviet Union lest it suffer its own demise. As they readied their country for war, Nazi leaders never tired of denouncing communism as a sinister Jewish plot. Large so-called anti-Bolshevik exhibits toured German cities during the 1930s to expose the USSR's Semitic face and deadly designs. Hundreds of thousands of German boys and men saw these ghastly exhibits prior to joining their nation's fight on the Eastern Front. In May 1939, the notoriously anti-Semitic Stürmer paper prepared its readers for what they called Germany's punitive campaign against Bolshevism. This imminent war would, quote, provide the same fate for the Jews in Russia that every murderer and criminal must expect, death sentence and execution. The Jews in Russia must be killed. They must be exterminated root and branch. Then the world will see that the end of the Jews is also the end of Bolshevism. The pact with Stalin put the campaign on hold until June 22, 1941, when more than 3 million German soldiers, the largest army in the nation's history, invaded the USSR. Prior to the campaign's start, Hitler ordered the troops on the ground to disavow international norms of warfare to which German soldiers felt bound fighting elsewhere in Europe. Specifically, they were to detain and mark for execution the political commissars in the Red Army who were described as savage and fanatical, the very personification of Jewish Bolshevism. German soldiers were also directed to use deadly force against civilians as needed. When they came face to face with millions of quote-unquote Bolsheviks who were supposedly more beast than human, German soldiers were to resort to the very cruelty and ruthlessness that was ascribed to the enemy. The invading troops widely embraced the Nazi phantasm of the Soviet Union as a Judeo-Bolshevik terror regime. As they entered Soviet homes, the first question soldiers posed to frightened residents was, Jude? Communist? Individuals who appeared to fit either category were taken away and executed. German soldiers in the East justified their actions with the injunction to obliterate the Soviet communist order. Quote, "We just know that this war is a war between good and evil, between reason and lunacy," a soldier from Göttingen wrote to his parents. The soldier asked his parents not to think that he had turned into a Nazi propagandist. He hadn't realized, he wrote, that, quote, "the picture that has been painted of Russia would pale against the horrific reality." In mid-August 1941, the Germans stepped up their killings. By then, the Wehrmacht had crossed through the Soviet Union's western borderlands, which had been annexed as part of Hitler's pact with Stalin, to reach core Soviet territory. In the borderlands, a sizable portion of the population resented the Soviet rulers and welcomed the Germans with salt and bread. As the Wehrmacht moved east, however, the reception was more muted and resistance greater. The Germans reflexively attributed this resistance to Jews, who formed a large part of the population in these historic areas of Jewish settlement. In reprisal for acts of sabotage, the SS annihilated whole Jewish communities, complete with women, children, and the elderly. Even small children counted as future resistance fighters and needed to be finished off, in the language of the SS death squads. As Hitler had admonished his generals prior to the campaign, if they fail to see Operation Barbarossa in his stark political terms, quote, "then while we may beat the enemy before us today, in 30 years we will be faced once more by the communist foe." It is important to underscore the particular standing of Soviet Jews in the Nazi German imagination. While the Nazis depicted all Jews as partaking in a global conspiracy, and while they railed against Jewish banks in New York, the Jewish plutocratic establishment in London, and the Jews of the Kremlin in Moscow, this is a quote from Hitler, they considered the Jews that hailed from the Soviet Union to be Germany's greatest menace. Operation Barbarossa differed from previous campaigns because it targeted an ostensibly Jewish state governed by a Jewish Marxist-Leninist faith in the Nazi imagination. As supposed operatives of a huge and heavily armed communist state, Soviet Jews were believed to wield political clout in ways other Jews and racial aliens did not. As German officials underscored, this warranted their death sentence. Germany's attack on the Soviet Union marked a pivotal turn, the climax of the German perception of communist Jews as a deadly political threat, motivating and putting into action a system of mass murder soon extended to Jews throughout Europe. The German-occupied Soviet lands became ground zero of a reign of unprecedented annihilation. To give just one example, less than 2 months after Operation Barbarossa began, on September 1st, 1941, all Jews living in Germany were ordered to wear a yellow star on their sleeves when in public. It was a mandate, Nazi newspaper explained, that was supposedly necessitated by Jewish atrocities performed against German soldiers at the Eastern Front. The Nazi project of murdering all Jews of Europe issued from a Nazi fixation on the Soviet Union as a Judeo-Bolshevik terror regime, reshaping the treatment of Jews everywhere. The Soviet Union played a pivotal role in one more respect. It was the principal power to halt and terminate Nazi mass murder. Jews, facing their own extinction, realized this with extraordinary clarity. Writing in his diary in the Vilniaus ghetto, in September 1942, 14-year-old Yitzhak Hudashevsky avidly followed the Battle of Stalingrad, aware that his own survival possibly hinged on its outcome. Quote, "We, sitting in the ghetto, read the reports every day and run around looking for good news. Everyone's attention is now turned to Stalingrad. Everyone is waiting, exhausted, for something concrete, for Germany's decisive defeat. Everyone is waiting for the longed-for peace when the exhausted world will straighten its back. In 1943, knowledge of the Red Army's triumph at Stalingrad inspired Jews slated for extinction to rise up in revolt. When SS troops entered the Warsaw Ghetto on April 19, 1943, for another mass deportation of Jews to Treblinka, they were attacked by young militants who had formed a combat organization. The insurgents were desperately short of weapons, which the Polish underground army had promised, but failed to send. Unable to withstand the Germans on military terms, the resistors sought symbolic meaning as freedom fighters. In a report broadcast to Jewish organizations in the United States, they refer to their doomed uprising as the, quote, Battle of Ghettograd. The name Ghettograd, the report made clear, was to evoke the, quote, stubbornness of Stalingrad, as well as the universal horizons of the Jewish fighters who strove to, quote, take revenge on fascism, on the enemy of their people, on the enemy of mankind. The courage of the ghetto fighters took Nazi leaders by surprise and prompted them to step up their killings of Jews, including of those who had up to then counted as useful laborers. Throughout May and June 1943, SS forces raided ghettos across eastern Galicia. To ensure that their men would treat the Jews with a fury adequate for their mission, SS officials had them watch a propaganda film about the Soviet secret police before sending them into the ghetto. The discovery of a fortified bunker system in the ghetto of Rohatyn confirmed to the German task force the reality of an enjoined communist Jewish enemy. 3 of the bunkers bore the names of cities that had become symbols of Soviet resistance: Stalingrad, Sevastopol, Leningrad. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising had awoken SS leaders to the prospect of further Jewish-led insurgencies, and their fears were justified. Led by an underground organization, prisoners in Treblinka rose up on August 2, 1943. Armed with axes and knives, they confronted the guards and set buildings on fire. Throngs of prisoners broke through the fences, and 100 managed to escape. An even larger uprising took place in Sobibor in October. It was organized by 80 Soviet POWs who had been brought from Minsk the month before. On October 14, the prisoners struck, nearly taking control over the entire camp. 11 SS men and several non-German guards were killed. 300 Jews escaped. The news from Sobibor alarmed Germans, especially given that the camp had held fewer than 1,000 Jewish prisoners on the day of the uprising. An insurgency in a camp with larger concentrations of Jews would likely cost more German lives. SS Chief Heinrich Himmler swiftly ordered all remaining Jews in the general government to be killed as soon as possible. SS commanders implementing his orders dispatched a heavily armed force of several thousand men to the 3 major camps of the general government, where they were instructed to carry out a coordinated strike under the codename Harvest Festival. In the Majdanek, Poniatowa, and Travniki camps, SS troops slaughtered more than 42,000 Jews in the course of 2 days. The destruction of the Vilniaus ghetto that we're commemorating today was part and parcel of these Nazi operations against Jewish Bolshevism. When the liquidation of the ghetto began in September 1943, Yitzhak Rudashevsky and his family went into hiding, yet their hiding place was discovered and all members of the family were killed in Ponary. Just yesterday, I saw for the first time the stumbling stone commemorating Yitzhak Rudashevsky at Rudinka Street number 8 in the former large ghetto. Yitzhak Rudashevsky did not live to see the Red Army enter Vilnius, but had he survived, he would certainly have hailed the Soviet soldiers as liberators. Curiously, both the role of the Soviet Union as a liberating power in World War II and its standing as the primary target of the Nazi campaign to murder all Jews of Europe are missing in most histories of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. When it comes to the memory of the most harrowing events of the war, the Soviet Union seems like the proverbial elephant in the room, omnipresent and overlooked. That the Stalinist state used narratives of liberation to legitimate the reimposition of dictatorial rule throughout Eastern Europe is beyond doubt. But what about the Soviet men and women who shouldered their country's war effort? Did they consciously fight for Stalin's empire? Scores of diaries and letters suggest how deeply Red Army soldiers were affected by Nazi atrocities, and how strongly they believed in the mission to free the world from fascism. The challenge today is to recover a bright memory of communist-led resistance to Nazi rule, along with the memory of the victims of Soviet communist rule. Historically speaking, these memories must not be treated as a zero-sum game. Thank you.
Thank you, Jochen. Now it is my pleasure to invite Violetta Davaluta to come to the podium. Professor Davaluta is professor at Vilniaus University, senior researcher at Lithuanian Cultural Research Institute.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this gathering. And I will be talking more about the local context and the period from 1940 to 1941. So, one of the most pernicious myths about the Second World War, which one still hears expressed in Lithuania even today, concerns the role of Lithuanian Jews in the Communist Party, and more specifically, their role in the mass repressions committed by the Soviets during the first year of occupation, from June 1940 to June 1941. The underlying idea of this myth, which was deliberately introduced and spread by Nazi propaganda during the war, is that Bolshevism was a Jewish plot to control the world, and the Jews were responsible for the suffering of the Lithuanian people at the hands of the Soviets, particularly with respect to the mass deportations that took place in June 1941, days before the Germans invaded the USSR, forcing the Soviets to retreat from Lithuania. The truth is different. The Stalinist regime repressed and deported occupied populations based not on racial criteria, but on social ones. Consequently, Jewish Lithuanians suffered at the hands of the Soviet occupation as much as ethnic Lithuanians. It is true that Jews, as a percentage of the population, were somewhat overrepresented in certain Communist Party structures, like the Komsomol Youth Organization. During the interwar period, Jews suffered from discrimination in education and on the job market. The Soviets preached equality and emphasized opportunities for upward social mobility, especially for the youth. And this appealed to many Jewish youths as well, who believed in this idealistic rhetoric and hoped to achieve emancipation. But it is equally true that Jews, as merchants and as professionals who lived predominantly in urban areas, were somewhat more likely to be deported or have their property confiscated by the Soviets than other ethnic groups. The point is that Lithuanian citizens of all ethnic groups were to be found among the victims and perpetrators of the crimes committed by the Soviet regime. But for reasons that I will describe in more detail, Lithuanians frequently tend to remember and think about the Soviet occupation and the period of World War II in terms of what others did to us instead of what we did to others. Moreover, the story of what they did to us is cast in ethnic terms, losing sight of the reality that Lithuanian citizens then and now come from various ethnic groups. This problem is not unique to Lithuania. It is a common problem, and many examples demonstrated that a preoccupation with national suffering turns national history into a kind of martyrology that often has little to do with the past as it really happened. So the aim of my presentation is to deconstruct the myth about Lithuanian Jews and the Soviet mass deportations of June 1941. The deportations that took place from the 22nd of May until the 22nd of June 1941 in Western Ukraine, Moldova, the Baltic states, and Western Belarus affected about 106,000 persons, including about 20,000 from Lithuania. Of these, 4,700, the male heads of families, were sent to prison camps, while about 13,000 family members, mostly wives and children, were sent to special settlements. Among those deported were more than 5,000 children, including about 1,000 children less than 4 years of age, about 2,000 between 5 and 10, and about 2,300 between 11 and 18. Jewish families were neither singled out nor spared from the June deportations in Lithuania. This much can be inferred from the number of Jews among those deported, over 1,700. It varies, sometimes about 2,000, we could say. This number was roughly proportionate to the percentage of Jews in the general population. 70% of those 20,000 deportees were ethnic Lithuanian, 17.7% were Poles, 9.2% were Jews, and 2% were Russians. These figures show that because Jews were somewhat overrepresented among urban, professional, and property-owning Lithuanians, they were affected by the mass deportations of June 1941 in proportion or even in excess of their share to the population as a whole. Nevertheless, some Lithuanians even today maintain the mistaken belief that the June 1941 deportations were committed by ethnic Jews against ethnic Lithuanians. This is the result of Nazi and Soviet propaganda. Indeed, in Soviet Lithuania, the experience of Lithuanian Jewish deportees was doubly forgotten. Not only was there a taboo on any memorialization of the deportations and all other forms of Soviet repression, but the Holocaust itself could hardly be mentioned as a distinct tragedy of the Jewish community. Virtually all of the work of memory was focused on the sufferings of the Soviet people at the hands of the Nazis. Meanwhile, although a few monuments to the deportations were erected from time to time in a clandestine manner, they were always quickly removed and were seen by very few people. And while a limited number of monuments to mass killings were established at key sites of the Holocaust in Lithuania, such as the 9th Fort in Kaunas or at Ponar, near Vilniaus, the explanatory notes placed on boards at the site did not refer to Jews, but to the Soviet people as the victims of Nazi crimes. Censorship and the lack of open discussion of the deportation led not only to the forgetting of the event in public discourse, but prevented any efforts to remediate the distorted narratives of Nazi propaganda, portraying all Jews as Bolsheviks, imposed by the German occupation that lasted from 1941 to 1944. Nazi-controlled newspapers introduced and perpetuated the myth of the double genocide, which implied that the Jews were responsible for the deportation of the Lithuanians, even though, as noted above, ethnic Jews and ethnic Lithuanians were to be found in roughly proportionate measure among the victims of the deportations. For example, in July 1941, just to give one example, a few weeks after the deportations, and just as the killing of the Jews began to accelerate, the German-controlled Lithuanian media was flooded with stories like the following. I quote, "On the red horse of communism, the Jews began to trample upon the Lithuanian nation, to suppress Lithuanian identity in the cities, to push Lithuanians out of offices and enterprises, to Russify and to Judaize them. Thousands of gray-haired women are now gazing with tears in their eyes along the road by which their sons, betrayed by the Jews, were transported away. Thousands of orphans and unhappy deportees are screaming, "Eliminate the Jews." End quote. This is from Naujoji Lietuva, published in Vilniaus. The myth of double genocide, that is, the idea that the genocide of the Jews was somewhat a just return of their role in the genocide of Lithuanians through Soviet deportation, was not dismantled during Soviet times. It remained in the distant recess of Soviet-Lithuanian collective memory until open discussion of the deportations became possible in the late 1980s. In the late 1980s, the publication of deportee memoirs in Soviet Lithuania was a major part of the return of memory that coincided with the legitimization of Soviet rule. The first open publication of deportee memoirs in 1987 stunned the reading public and immediately took an important place in the collective memory of Lithuanians as an oppressed nation. As former exile from the USSR, Professor Emeritus from Yale University, Thomas Venclova, asserted at the time, I quote, the sentiment of national identity brushed aside all social and individual distinctions and ensured a dramatic national consolidation that led Lithuania into independent existence, end quote. Scholars at the time spoke of the return of memory throughout East Central Europe in the universalist terms of human rights and as a manifestation of the power of the powerless. In retrospect, however, it is equally clear that some narratives were highlighted at the expense of others. For the crimes of the Soviet regime were not the only memories of trauma repressed by Soviet censorship. In Lithuania, as throughout the bloodlands of East Central Europe, the imposition of communism was inextricably tied to the experience of Nazi German occupation. For Irena Veisaitė, whom many of you may know, a Jewish Lithuanian intellectual and Holocaust survivor who participated actively in the anti-Soviet popular movement in the late 80s, the return of Lithuanian memory during that time was a welcome sign of political change, as well as a painful reminder of a tortured past that would continue to divide Lithuanian society. Interviewed in 1992, she shared the following recollections about a meeting of Sąjūdis, that popular movement that took place at the peak of its popularity and influence in 1988. I quote, "They were going on and on about Lithuanian victims and sufferings, and I suddenly thought, what am I doing here? My mother was a victim, my whole family, my 3-year-old cousin, and they have no place here, not even a mention. But then I thought it is the first time that Lithuanians can talk about their sufferings, about the truth. We must understand their happiness and share it. But to this day, there have been only a few statements from the intelligentsia and a few official gestures concerning the Lithuanian role in the Holocaust." End quote. The publication of deportee memoirs and the broader campaign to record the history of Soviet repression was part of a conscious political strategy of construction of a new post-Soviet Lithuanian identity during the popular movement against Soviet rule. Activists distributed questionnaires to citizens across the country to come up with an accurate list of those deported, killed, or otherwise repressed during the initial Sovietization of Lithuania. However, there was no effort to effort made to identify the ethnic or religious identity of the victims. This canvassing of data on the repressions was part of an effort of social consolidation and political mobilization. The intent was to present the nation as a unified whole and not to emphasize ethnic or confessional differences. It is also worth noting that the return of deportee memory in Lithuania had a strong religious aspect insofar as the Catholic Church played such a prominent role in the anti-Soviet resistance. The narrative of the repression of the Catholic Church and Christian notions of Christ-like suffering were closely intertwined with that of the deportation. During the popular movement, the retrieval from Siberia and the reburial of the remains of deportees in Lithuania was overlain with Catholic rites and ceremonies, crosses and icons, all of which reinforced the ethnic Lithuanian and Catholic dimension of the identity of the deportees and their experience. Indeed, it was only during the research and preparations for a special exhibition on Lithuanian Jews during the Soviet period in 2014 that a group of researchers from the Vilna Gaon State Jewish Museum combed through this list to identify probable Jewish deportees based on the family names of the listed deportees. A parallel effort was conducted by researchers working for the International Commission for the Evaluation of the Crimes Committed by the Nazi and Soviet occupational regimes in Lithuania. It was established in 1998, and the researchers at that time calculated Jewish Lithuanians deported, and their calculations of the total number of deported Jews differed only slightly. So, in conclusion, I would like to say this. Today, the Lithuanian experience of World War II is typically related through several narratives that diverge or sometimes even come into friction. One of them is the narrative of fighting and suffering of ethnic Lithuanians, usually associated with mass deportations, the anti-Soviet insurgency, and its defeat through mass repression. Meanwhile, for most Lithuanian Jews, the war is overwhelmingly identified with the German invasion of the USSR and the Holocaust that followed, and all what happened afterwards, the destruction of the community. At that time, many Lithuanians viewed the German invasion as liberation from the Soviets, while the Jewish population considered the brutal Soviet occupation as the lesser of two evils. The dominant memory regime in post-Soviet Lithuania was established in the late 1980s during the popular movement against Soviet rule, a movement that was powerfully associated with the popular discovery of narratives of mass deportation to the Gulag and Stalinist repressions. After the collapse of communism and the restoration of national independence in 1991, Lithuanians faced another challenge of recognizing and reconciling differences and building a sense of nationhood inclusive of otherness. The difficulty of coming to terms with the history of World War II and its aftermath in Eastern Europe stems from the transformative effects that mass displacement, occupation, resistance, and repression had upon the complex, multi-layered societies in the region. Propaganda and its legacy in hate speech and anti-Semitism are clearly another major factor complicating historical reckoning. One way of addressing this problem is to remember and relate the experience of people whose life stories disrupt the boundaries between memories and debunk the myths of propaganda. The story of Lithuanian Jews who were deported by the Soviets in June 1941, just weeks before the German invasion of the Soviet Union, is a story that needs remembering and retelling. The experience stands as a living refutation of the myth Judeo-Bolshevism, the myth of Judeo-Bolshevism, and reveals the collective trauma of Stalinist repressions in its true light. Thank you for your attention.
So, before the coffee break, I wonder if there are any questions for any of the panelists, and we would be delighted to take questions if there were any. If there are no questions, then we will adjourn for a coffee break and return in about 15 minutes for the second half of the conference. Thank you very much. start now? Thank you, everyone. Please take a seat so we can get started. Before we get started, I would like to call everyone's attention to the resolution on terrorist attacks and military aggression against the State of Israel that has been declared by the Seimas of the Republic of Lithuania. And there are copies. I will not read it, but there are copies of this resolution available which one can read. There is going to be a slight change in the program. Rabbi Andrew Baker is going to speak after Faina Kukliansky. But it is a great pleasure for me now to invite Faina, the chair of the Lithuanian Jewish community, to give her comments.
Good day, everybody. Do we have simultan to Lithuanian language as well? Okay, tai aš kalbėsiu lietuviškai.
Then I'll be speaking Lithuanian, and I guess some of you will understand the Lithuanian language, and I have particularly, I want to particularly address school children. Dear school children who have come here to this conference. First and foremost, I am grateful to you for coming, and I'm grateful to Ingrida who brought you here. This conference is very important. We've been debating on this matter for quite many years. But tell me, children, well, you're not children, you are teenagers, in fact. So I wonder, have you ever heard of such definition as judo Bolshevism, judo communism? I believe you've never heard of that concept, neither at school nor in your life. And if you've been listening very carefully to the presentations that were made during the first part of the conference, you already had to understand what a judo communism is. Well, this topic is relevant for us today. As members of society, irrespective of whether we are children or grown-ups, it is also very important to you as teenagers. If you are interested in history, in politics, this is particularly relevant to you. So I will start my presentation with the natural law. By the way, my speech is very similar to the presentation that was made by my dear colleague, but I will be speaking about the natural law. Do you know what natural law is, children? Well, natural law is... Natural rights are the rights that every person acquires once in the mother's womb, irrespective of the person's race, irrespective of the person's political views, and irrespective of his skin color, and so on and so forth. So I am beginning my speech. Well, unfortunately, the speaker of the Seimas has already left, but still I want to address her as well. Honorable Speaker Victoria Chmielite-Nielsen, Director of the Evo Institute, Dr. Jonathan Brent,
Director of the Polish Institute of Jewish History, Monica Krawczyk. Well, Monica Krawczyk is sitting right next at the table. And by the way, the idea to organize this conference was initiated in Poland when we were commemorating the anniversary of the victory against the fight against Nazism. Other distinguished members of parliament and guests, I'm not from the academia. I'm not a researcher. I am taking part here as the chairwoman of the Lithuanian Jewish community. So my presentation will not be scientific. I hope you'll forgive me that. Jerome Kerman, professor of political science and chairman of the Charles Walgreen Foundation, believes that the political philosophy of responsible governance has been a neglected field for many years. This period has been characterized by a complete rejection of natural law, the standard by which governance relations have traditionally been measured. Law and rights emanated from states. In democracies, it was assumed that the majority would create law and guarantee rights. Other than these, no legal constraints could bind a sovereign state. In recent years, a distinctive phenomenon of the 20th century, the totalitarian regime, has led political philosophers to re-examine the traditionalist doctrine of natural law, which emphasizes the limited power of the state. Today, I would like to express my sincere gratitude for the opportunity to speak on this topic. For quite a long time, Lithuanian Jews have not had the opportunity to share their thoughts on the painful deportation of the Lithuanian population and on the role of Judo Bolsheviks. It's now 83 years since the beginning of the mass deportations of the Lithuanian population to Siberia. For the Jewish people who have suffered the exile foretold in the Torah since the time of the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Romans, the ordeal of exile can be seen as part of their historical identity. By the way, the exile, the life of the Jews during the Soviet era, and the attitude of the current independent Lithuanian government and its people towards their fellow Jews and their history are completely related to the psychology of natural law, the psychology of the crowd, in this case the ethnic crowd, and the governance of the state, if we relate the latter to the principles of natural law. On the eve of the first Soviet occupation, the majority of Lithuanian Jews were concentrated in cultural, social, and political organizations and societies. Between the two world wars, the most active and influential in Lithuania, according to historian Tatarūnas, were the representatives of the Jewish cultural right, who advocated the creation of an independent Jewish nation-state in Palestine. After the ultimatum by the Soviets of the 14th of June 1940 and the ensuing occupation, the Jewish press was restricted. After the Soviet occupation of Lithuania, all newspapers belonging to both Jewish organizations of the political right and left of the political spectrum were closed down as well. Following the ban on the entire Jewish press, only Volksblatt, which belonged to the Jewish People's Party and was popular with the communists, was temporarily left. However, it was soon closed down as well. In January 1941, it was replaced by the only Yiddish-language Jewish communist newspaper published in the Soviet Republic of Lithuania. Do you know what Yiddish language is? Children, do you know what Yiddish language is? It's the language that was spoken in Lithuania by Jewish. So the newspaper was called Der Emes, the truth, based on a bibliographical list compiled by Volksblatt editor Judelmark. Historian Solomon Atamuk says that before the Second World War there were 16 Jewish daily newspapers, 30 weekly newspapers, 13 non-periodicals, and almost 20 collections of literature in Lithuania. In the years from 1919 to 1940, as many as 288 Jewish periodicals and non-periodicals saw the light of day in the Republic of Lithuania. According to the data provided by Liudas Truska from the Lithuanian State Archives, in 1939, there were 8 Jewish daily newspapers, 3 weekly newspapers, and the same number of non-periodicals in Lithuania and Vilnius region. The daily newspapers had a circulation of 44,000, the circulation of the weeklies amounted to 7,900, and the circulation of the non-periodicals was 3,850 copies. In addition to banning the Jewish press and dismissing the editors of their publications, the system was also reorganized or closed down to shut down the scientific institutes. Well, I'm very happy to have Dr. Jonathan Brent with us. So the activities of the Institute of Jewish Culture in Lithuania was restricted. Employees such as Eli Kalmanovich and Grodzinski were made redundant. Various books, newspapers, and sets of proclamations were seized from the Institute. The law on the closure of Hebrew language libraries not only restricted the Jewish press, but also restricted access to Hebrew language literature. Do you know what Hebrew language is? Hebrew language is the language that all saints' holy scripts were written. And it is the language that is taught at the Shalom Aleichem school here in Vilnius. Our community, which was striving for traditional Jewish ethnic education, was also oppressed. Instead of Jewish schools, which had previously been dominated by Hebrew as the language of instruction and promoted the national idea and religious values, the Soviet administration began to build an entirely new system based on state schools. There were no more private or community schools. Some Jewish schools were simply closed down, or the rest were converted into state schools. In addition, the traditional National Jewish Studies program also disappeared. Several former disciplines, for example, religion, were removed from the curriculum and replaced by new disciplines such as compulsory classes of the Russian language and the Constitution of the USSR. The previously unheard of post of communist organizer, which was called Komsorg, was introduced in schools. As the Soviet system targeted communal property, much private property, businesses, and capital were also nationalized. According to the data provided by the Economic Research Department of the People's Bank, in 1937 there were 6,675 Jewish-owned artisan workshops in more than 200 Lithuanian towns and cities, employing more than 12,000 workers who made clothes and shoes. This accounted for 56 of all such businesses in Lithuania. Around 7.5% of Lithuanian Jews were major merchants who owned shops, and around 46% were involved in small-scale trade. Most of the owners of such businesses had their personal property rights restricted during the first years of the Soviet occupation, and some, especially the owners of the larger businesses, were repressed. In 1940, 1,597 small trading houses were nationalized, of which 1,320 were owned by Jews, representing 83% of the total number of expropriated businesses. At the end of July and the beginning of August 1940, the total value of the 986 nationalized large industrial enterprises amounted to 413,412 Lithuanian litas. Of these, 560 enterprises, representing 57%, with a value of 147,000 litas, were owned by Jews. In Kaunas alone, 186 Jewish firms were nationalized. In Vilnius, this number accounted for 102, while in Šiauliai and in its district, the number of Jewish firms that were nationalized accounted for 53. These companies produced food, clothing, footwear, fabrics, leather, and provided a livelihood for a large part of the Lithuanian population. In the course of the land reform, Jews were deprived of their land, and in parallel, they were subjected to physical violence, such as arrest. Not only the Jewish right wing, such as the Zionist Workers' Party in the Vilnius region, but also activists from left-wing organizations, such as the Bund and the People, Rosenthal, Zheleznov, Teitel, and others were arrested and repressed. One of the first victims of the repression was Zalman Reisen, the editor of Vilnartog, a newspaper with extreme radical pro-Soviet views. One of the members of the Yiddish Cultural Union, Yiddish Culture Verein in Vilnius, the well-known lawyer and publicist Joseph Chernyakov, formerly known as the main defender of the communists in political trials, was also arrested. In Vilnius and throughout Lithuania, prominent Jewish public figures were imprisoned and eventually deported by the Soviet system. These people included Reuven Rubinstein, editor of the newspaper Die Yiddish Stimme, Leiber Gernfulkel, a prominent public figure, Menahem Begin, chairman of the Polish Jewish organization Beitar, which was active in the Vilnius region and which later became the president of Israel, and others. And then deportations began. According to Jewish historiography, during the June 1941 deportations alone, some 3,000 Jewish activists from the right and left of the political spectrum, as well as owners of large industrial enterprises and factories, were deported. As many as 7,000 of our compatriots were exiled in the first Soviet period. 82 years ago, in 1941, about 1% of the Jewish community of Lithuania was deported. In percentage terms, this is the largest part of the ethnic community. However, the repressions did not destroy the Jewish national identity. Zionist organizations were active underground, Hebrew education was provided, and every effort was made to make it possible to help members of the Jewish community to leave for Palestine. The Jewish deportees returned to Lithuania after 1970, after the closed borders policy had been changed and there were no real opportunities, especially with the help of Jewish organizations in the West, to leave the Soviet Union. Most of them later took advantage of this opportunity. Upon their return to Lithuania, the Jewish exiles were faced with the unbearable pain of not finding their relatives who had been brutally murdered in the Holocaust. They also found the Jewish town destroyed. Russian dissidents sought reforms within the USSR. Lithuanian dissidents dreamed of Lithuanian independence. Emigration to Israel became a priority for Jews. This is why most of them did not publicly oppose the Soviet system, especially as Lithuania had the highest number of permits to leave for Israel compared to other regions of the Soviet Union. This led to a large wave of emigration of Jews from the USSR to Lithuania, which was to become a transit station to Israel. Some of them did not go to Israel and even established strong ties with Lithuanian dissidents and remained in Lithuania. These Jews and their descendants have become part of the present-day Lithuanian Jewish community. It is disappointing that the concept of a Jewish deportee is almost forgotten or ignored in Lithuanian society and state today, and that the deportation is perceived as a tragedy of the ethnic Lithuanian nation, which has already been mentioned by the previous speaker, Professor Davoliūtė. Perhaps that is why the rights of former Jewish deportees have been restored in different ways by the laws of independent Lithuania, even in the present-day Lithuania. Jewish deportees have become what are known as forgotten victims. This is well illustrated by the history of the laws on restoration of citizenship and property rights in the Republic of Lithuania. It should be noted that these laws have been liberalized, for which we are grateful to the Lithuanian state, but it should be noted that in many cases some things were done belatedly. From 1940 to 1990, the concept of Lithuanian citizenship was completely abolished. It existed legally but could not be implemented in the occupied territory. By establishing the citizens of the Republic of Lithuania, that the citizens of the Republic of Lithuania are first and foremost those who were citizens of the Republic of Lithuania before the 15th of June 1940, the continuity of the independent state of Lithuania, restored on the 11th of March 1990, was also confirmed. However, this continuity was also partially established. The requirement to renounce the citizenship of another state essentially meant that Lithuanian citizens who had acquired the citizenship of another state were deemed to have lost their former Lithuanian citizenship. This requirement was clearly unacceptable to the vast majority of Lithuanian citizens who had acquired the citizenship of another state. They, in fact, were deprived of the Lithuanian citizenship. In 1995, the law on citizenship was amended and it removed the previous clause stating if they have not acquired the citizenship of another state. However, for Jews, including deportees, this condition did not disappear. They were covered by the concept of repatriates. Thus, all the Jewish deportees who went to Israel after their Soviet exile could not exercise their right to regain citizenship of the Republic of Lithuania at that time, even though they had never voluntarily renounced it, even when they were sent to Siberia. At the same time, they have never recovered their nationalized or otherwise expropriated Soviet property, even though they were deported for it. By the way, the loss of citizenship is still relevant to this day, which is why efforts are being made to amend the constitution of Lithuania by referendum. Unfortunately, the narrative of ethnic deportees is still undeniably dominant today. Even the deportees themselves have allegedly forgotten that they had been deported together with their Jewish neighbors. The same message is heard over and over again. The deportation is about Lithuanians, while the Holocaust is about Jews. I believe that there will be those who will adopt yet another very strong narrative. The deportees were Lithuanians, the communists were Jews, and the rescuers were Lithuanians. This is the way ignorance of history and truth will continue to divide Lithuanian society, and historical memory will become oblivion, as will the natural rights of all Lithuanian citizens. Today I am speaking on behalf of the Lithuanian Jewish community. Our community is also a community of deportees. We share the pain of deportation. It is familiar to the people of Lithuania belonging to almost all ethnic groups. We mark the day of mourning and hope in Lithuania on the 14th of June every year as a day of pain and unity. Remembering the pain of deportation should bring people together, should unite them rather than divide them. After all, it is understandable and human that the lives of all the deportees were desecrated and that all of them dreamt of returning home to their homeland. After all, Lithuania was the homeland of all the deportees. Thank you.
Thank you, Faina. Now I would like to welcome to the podium Rabbi Andrew Baker, who is Director of the Department of International Affairs of the American Jewish Community.
My presentation is actually a departure from much of the topic up till now. A New York Times story appeared in print 28 years ago this month. It described what people here already knew, titled, "Piles of Storied Jewish Books Are Languishing in Lithuania." It explained that over 100,000 volumes were kept in an unheated former church building that served as an annex to the National Library. This pre-war collection of Jewish books and manuscripts, as well as the archives of YIVO, had become the property of the National Library of Lithuania. There were calls for Lithuania to transfer these books to Jewish institutions in Israel or in the United States that would be able to care for them and make use of them. Lithuania rejected these calls, averring that this collection was part of its national cultural heritage. On one of my visits to Vilnius several years later, I was taken to this annex building by Dr. Vladis Bulavas, the director of the National Library. He wanted to show me that they were now all on shelves and being properly organized. Once back in the main building of the National Library, he said he had something else to show me, and I accompanied him to the basement storage rooms. There, on a set of steel shelves, each one neatly wrapped in a burlap sack, were over 300 Hebrew scrolls. These turned out to include several dozen Torah scrolls and many partial scrolls. How they came to the National Library was itself a remarkable story. In the immediate post-war years, Antanas Ulpis, the director of the library at the time, made it his mission to collect these scrolls and Jewish books that were left without any Jewish owner. He defied Soviet orders to hand over items of special value so they could be taken to Moscow. According to one account, he hid them in the library itself, placing them behind the multi-volume collections of the writings of Marx and Lenin, secure in the knowledge that no one browsing in the library would ever take one of those books off the shelf. On one of my subsequent visits, I was accompanied by Professor David Fishman, then YIVO's chief archivist. We stopped in the National Archives building where YIVO's pre-war records were stored. YIVO had moved its headquarters to New York in 1940, but materials left behind ended up here. Some of them, like the Torah scrolls, were also rescued by Antanas Ulpis. In the post-communist environment, YIVO had sought to reclaim them and bring them to New York. They included correspondence between YIVO's directors and other Jewish organizations from the 1920s and 1930s that were of limited interest to anyone outside of the organization's own archivists. Nevertheless, the government here objected, again saying these were part of Lithuania's cultural heritage. YIVO reluctantly reached an agreement that allowed it to take some limited number of documents to New York to be restored and copied, with the obligation that they were then to be returned here to Vilnius. David said YIVO had hired a few elderly Yiddish-speaking Jews to help them here sort through the individual documents. They would come to the National Archives each day to do this work, but they did not make very much progress. As David described it to me, they got here in the morning, they would schmooze with each other, they would sip tea, they would reminisce, And if they got through half a dozen documents, that was progress. There was much left to do. Books and documents are one thing, but Torah scrolls quite another. David joined me in my meeting with Prime Minister Andris Kubilius, where I made this appeal to him. Jewish books belong on library shelves, whether those shelves are in New York or Jerusalem or Vilnius. But Torah scrolls belong in synagogues for use in worship. So let us take these scrolls and bring them to congregations in Israel and America and elsewhere where they will be read and treasured. That marked the beginning of a 2-year effort to convince the Lithuanian government and 2 prime ministers to let this happen. Lithuania was not the only Eastern European government in possession of Torah scrolls. All countries in this region once had large Jewish communities that were decimated in the Holocaust. In the immediate post-war years, some of these Torah scrolls found their way to Israel and the West. Others were neglected and deteriorated over time, but some had remained in government hands. As each country labored to define and reassert its own national identity in the wake of a dissolving Soviet Union, they were all jealously protective of their national heritage, even if they had not yet fully defined it. For Jews who had a long history of being persecuted in these same countries, and whose religion and language also separated them from the majority population, the argument that these Torah scrolls were a treasured part of Lithuanian or Ukrainian or Belarusian heritage was rich indeed. Be that as it may, there was no way to legally challenge this argument. Instead, we had to persuade them. And in these efforts, we were helped by the American government. As with the establishment of commissions to address Holocaust history, and later with the restitution of Jewish communal property, the United States had significant influence. Letters from members of Congress, the intercession of State Department diplomats, and the on-the-ground help from American ambassadors played a critical role. Naturally, when Lithuanian leaders visited Washington, we made every effort to get the subject of Torah scrolls on the agenda. Nevertheless, I was quite surprised to discover when I met with President Valdis Adamkus in January of 2002 how successful we were. He had just come from a meeting with President George W. Bush, and the American president had asked him to help with the return of these Torah scrolls. Immediately as I walked into the room, even before saying hello, he held up his hands and said, "I'm doing everything I can," assuming I knew exactly what he was talking about. I did not at first. He said, "But I am only the president, not the head of government. It isn't my decision to release these Torahs." But of course he could help, and I am sure he did. By the time of that meeting, almost 4 years since we had first met in Riga, we had developed a friendly relationship and could speak candidly with each other. We had also shared a forever remembered experience. We were together on the morning of September 11th, 2001. President Adamkus was on an official visit to Washington, and I hosted him for an early morning breakfast with Jewish organizational leaders that day. We had an open and lively discussion in a windowless meeting room of the downtown Washington Westin Hotel. When breakfast was over, he was hustled off by the U.S. Secret Service delegation that accompanied him, and I walked down the block to our AJC offices. At that moment, my staff was huddled around a television set, watching footage of the 2 planes crashing into the World Trade Center towers in New York. We then heard a bang and looked south out our top floor windows, and we could see smoke billowing up from the Pentagon. As a visiting head of state, President Adamkus was permitted to fly out of Washington, even as all other flights were grounded. His scheduled meeting with President Bush was postponed, and that was what brought him back to Washington the following January. Convincing the Lithuanian government to return these Torah scrolls was only half the problem. The next question was to whom they should be returned. The Jewish community in Lithuania was small and already had enough scrolls to meet its needs. There were synagogues in Israel, in Western Europe, and in the United States that would certainly welcome receiving one of them, and it would be particularly meaningful for those whose congregants were Lithuanian Jews. We reached an initial understanding with the government and National Library that there should be first an examination of all the scrolls by someone able to assess their full condition from a Jewish perspective. My partner in these efforts and someone who became a dear friend was Rabbi Abba Dunner in London. Abba served as the executive director of the Conference of European Rabbis, the umbrella organization of mainstream Orthodox rabbis. But Abba's father had been the chief rabbi of Königsberg, the pre-war Russian city that is today known as Kaliningrad, situated in that Russian enclave barely 200 miles from here. And that also gave him a very personal interest in this. Abba decided he would take it on himself to examine each scroll, and I persuaded the cultural minister to allow this to happen. Although there were over 300 scrolls in storage, they included only 42 complete Torahs. There were some 100 partial Torah scrolls or fragments of scrolls, along with some number of Megillot, scrolls of biblical books of Esther, Lamentations, Proverbs, Song of Songs, and Samuel. The National Library insisted it would keep 10 of the Torah scrolls in Vilnius to remain as part of its overall collection. The State of Israel joined in these efforts through the involvement of Rabbi Michael Melchior. Rabbi Melchior, who was born in Denmark, was part of a distinguished family of rabbis that served the Jewish communities of Scandinavia. And he himself had served as the chief rabbi of Norway before making Aliyah to Israel. At this time now, he was a Knesset member and had been appointed Minister for Diaspora Affairs. We agreed that there needed to be a common address to which these Lithuanian scrolls could be returned, especially as the government was receiving a growing number of private requests. We would be that address. We proposed that the scrolls should first be brought to Israel. There they would be repaired and then distributed to congregations in Israel and in the diaspora. As Rabbi Melchior put it, this would be the literal expression of the Hebrew maxim, Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah. Out of Zion shall go forth the law, shall go forth the Torah. As a minister, Rabbi Melchior promised to organize a special El Al flight to bring the scrolls from Vilnius to Jerusalem. And so it was on January 31st, 2002, as promised, an El Al plane landed in Vilnius carrying Rabbi Melchior, but accompanied by a large Israeli delegation, including the Ashkenazi chief rabbi and Israeli media. An official ceremony took place in the large foyer of the National Library where the scrolls were formally presented to us. Joining us there was Danis Ulpis, the son of that librarian who originally rescued many of these scrolls. He described his boyhood experience of a father showing him where he had stored these scrolls, many originally in an empty church building, and explaining how people had discarded them, fearful in Soviet times of what might happen to them if they were discovered in their possession. Following the ceremony, Abba Dunner and I accompanied the Israeli delegation and the Torah scrolls on that El Al flight to Israel. A special area of the tarmac at Ben Gurion Airport had been set aside for the plane's arrival. As we walked down the stairway carrying the scrolls, we were met with another large crowd and more welcoming speeches, something that would be befitting the arrival of a delegation of high-level foreign dignitaries. And in a way, that's what these Torah scrolls were. Some months would pass before the scrolls could be repaired and distributed, and fewer of them proved to be in usable condition than we had hoped. One Torah scroll was sent to a new congregation in Budapest. Another went to a Jewish day school in Manchester, England. A third went to the Nevi Shalom synagogue in Istanbul, which had been the target of a recent terrorist attack. The scroll itself was transformed from an Ashkenazic to a Sephardic style by being placed in a specially built wooden case or teak before being sent to Turkey. Meanwhile, aware that Lithuanian Prime Minister Algirdas Brazauskis was scheduled to visit Washington in March 2004, we arranged for 3 of the Megillot Esther, 3 of the scrolls of the book of Esther that is read on the holiday of Purim, to be brought to Washington. They were presented to 3 rabbis of the city's prominent Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox synagogues at a special gathering with the Prime Minister present. Following the program, a line of congregants formed, many of them Litvaks, eager to shake hands with the Prime Minister and to express their appreciation for his help in bringing these scrolls back to Jewish congregations. He was visibly moved by this and understood the importance of allowing this piece of Lithuania's cultural heritage to return to its Jewish home. Shortly after the scrolls were taken to Israel, we again raised the subject of restituting former Jewish communal property with Prime Minister Brazauskis. He recognized that this successful process we had employed for these Torah scrolls could perhaps serve as a model here, and at that meeting appointed his advisor to lead the government's negotiations with me on the restitution or compensation of Jewish communal property. And so it was, only 10 years and 2 prime ministers later, that we finalized an agreement for the payment of compensation for these properties, which led, of course, to the creation of the Goodwill Foundation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that story, Rabbi Baker. Next, I would like to welcome Monica Kravchik, who is director of Żych in Warsaw, the Jewish Historical Institute.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And I would like to say good morning, or it's already afternoon. Shalom Aleichem, Laba Diena, Dzień dobry. I was given in the program 10 minutes, and I will stick to those 10 minutes, so don't worry. My remark is of a little bit different nature, because I would like to stress that, first of all, we are very happy to cooperate with the Jewish community of Lithuania and Madam President, Advocate Faina Kuklanski, who is our contact. She's very much respected and appreciated in Poland, so thank you very much for being the regional leader, actually, for the Jewish community here in Central and Eastern Europe. And it's also a great pleasure to be in the parliament, in the Seimas of Lithuania, and it's extremely moving that our cooperation is expressed also in the fact that Poland and Lithuania shared the Commonwealth, the common state for so many centuries. And of course, there are many bonds connecting Poland and Lithuania, and one of them is the Jewish community, so terribly treated during the Second World War and decimated in the genocide that was called later Holocaust. But to go back and look into some positive notes, the fact that we are in the parliament shows me or asks me to mention that there was an existence of Jewish Sejm also, of 4 lands in the Crown of Poland, and parallel Sejm of Jewish Sejm of Lita, of Lithuania, and it existed from 1580 until 1764, and this was possibility to develop as one distinct community in democratic dimension and reality of those times. Back in the history, but it also showed the importance and autonomic level of functioning of the Jewish community in relation to the state authorities, to the kings of Poland and great prince of Lithuania. The concept allowing full religious development gave the world later on in the 18th century Rabbi Eliyahu ben Shlomo Zalman, the famous Vilna Gaon. His influence was tremendous and far-reaching. His way of Litvak religious Orthodox style was adopted from Warsaw and Königsberg until Minsk, Kobrin, and further. He died in 1797, 2 years after brutal partition of Poland, Lithuanian Commonwealth, and this part of our country coming under domination of Tsarist Russia. We need to mention Gaon's Rabbi Eliyahu love for land of Israel and the fact that many of his direct students established one of the most important Ashkenazi community in land of Israel at that time under Ottoman Turkish Empire. Vilna has many sons and daughters who are worthy of mentioning, and if we fast forward, as we are in the year of 80th anniversary of ghetto, both establishment of the ghetto liquidation and uprising, military uprising, both in Vilna and both in Warsaw, we should mention righteous, courageous heroes who were connected to those both locations. Mordechai Tannenbaum, Tosia Altman, Arie Wilner, Itzhak Zuckerman. All of them were idealistic Zionist socialists, members of youth organization, especially Hashomer Hatzair, the young guardian. They were educators and role models, and they had to participate, and willingly they participated in the fight for their freedom and dignity against Nazi Germans during Second World War, defending the Jewish honor. Well, it's very moving to mention their names here in the Sejm, and may their memory be blessed. And we hope for further development of many historical subjects and ties, both with Poland and Lithuania, and also those who share this heritage all over the world, on every continent, including maybe Antarctica soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Monica. Our concluding speaker is Dr. Linas Venklauskas, who is Vytautas Magnus University Sugihara Diplomats for Life Foundation, who is with the foundation. Dr. Venklauskas.
Thank you, dear organizers, dear distinguished guests and colleagues. I will speak in Lithuanian, just addressing in English language, so get prepared your translation items, whoever needs it. Taigi mano tema.
My topic is Jewish socialists and Zionists and Lithuanian anti-Semitic perspective in the end of the 19th century and 1940. I will underline the positions in Lithuanian periodical publications. I have the opinion that by constructing modern identities, communication is very important. The way we speak, we communicate is very important to how we see each other and our attitude towards others. From the Lithuanian anti-Semitic perspective, the Jewish community was seen as a monolith. They were not seen as separate individuals. They were seen in unison and referred to as they do this or do not do that. The second common denominator in this context is that Lithuanian Jews are being referred to outside the thinking of Jews. The attitudes of the authors are put in the mouths of the Jews, of allegedly the Jewish saying this or that. And now I would like to give you some of the quotations of some of the publications of that time. Of course, we can discuss this topic throughout the night. In chronological terms, in the Lithuanian press, neither socialists nor Zionists were not represented. According to my research and information, I found that the first information on the Jewish was found in 1900, and Jewish Zionists were mentioned for the first time. But very often, no matter whether this was 19th century or 20th century, Jewish Zionist was seen as a negative phenomenon. So in this case, authors claimed that the Jewish communities lost a part of their income due to the monopoly of the liquor. And the press said that the richer Jews were purchasing land in Palestine. And I would like to quote: "When we go to Palestine, Jews say, what can we do there? Because we'll not have simple peasants there, and we will be forced to work hard and labor hard, and we don't like this. We as Zionists can only be happy. Let them go to Palestine." The greatest part of the Jewry, Lithuanians, thought so. So in principle, this national understanding is seen as alleviating the burden on the part of Lithuanians. In 1904, We also say the reflection on the formation of Jewish identity through the anti-Semitic prism of Lithuanians. The Lithuanian press informs the reader that the Zionist movement is funded by rich Jews, that rich Jews purchase lands and they give to charity. Even the poor ones donate money to the charity, and all the Jews contribute to this phenomenon. And I would like to quote. The author claims to have participated in the meeting of the Zionists and says that the meeting of Zionists took place in Minsk. And he says, "Oh God, it was such an argument. It seemed to be the devil's place." And they shouted that they have bought the Palestine. Some of the Jews said that they are quite well here without the Palestine. End of quote. So this is the unified vision of Jews without giving any alternatives, and it represents Jewish as alien to Lithuanians, and they are presented in a unified way, according to a unified model. One more quotation from another publication in terms of about the Jewish Zionist movement. The Jewish would move from Lithuania, and we Lithuanians would become tradesmen, and we would do away without the Jewish mediation. It would be quite positive if Lithuanians lived in cities and towns and trade in them, and we would have Lithuanians only and the Lithuanian language. So this Jewish national movement, again, is seen as a possibility to do away without the Jews, so without showing any solidarity to the new formation of the Jewish identity. I have to underline that I work with the anti-Semitic publications. Certainly, there were other publications that were not in opposition to the Jewish identity. Moving to 1922-23, when we have the independence in Lithuania, but the rhetoric towards the Jewish population has not changed much. In addition to attempts to go to Palestine and Jewish Zionic movements, it is seen that Lithuanians are constructing and building their own state and claim that the Jews can leave if they don't like Lithuania. But I quote, the Lithuanian Jews say that they are the owners of Lithuania, and such rights are enjoyed by the Jews only in Lithuania. But it is the behavior of Jews that leads to all the misfortunes of them. They use the Russian language and they teach the Russian language to their children rather than Lithuanian. And we can see that the Jews do not care about Lithuania. And the attitude is formed that the Jews do not behave according to the expectations of Lithuanians. On the other hand, claims are that the conditions for exercising the rights for Jews are excellent in Lithuania. Another quotation is that we cannot deny the fact that the Jewish persons are smuggling gold to Palestine. Unfortunately, Lithuanians are too slow to react to that. Lithuanians are being deceived because they are simpletons, because the Jewish would like to take over all the Lithuanian institutions and authorities. So the context seemed to be the same. Well, certainly the Jews do not participate in this discourse, but they are portrayed in the said manner. Later on, the Jews are associated with the socialist ideas, equally to the idea of Zionist. A certain global context is given by explaining why the situation of Jews is deteriorating and why they're being hated, discriminated against. And I quote from the publication of 1922, seemingly the dark deeds of the Jews have become evident, such as creating different communities, smuggling gold, and taking on different names for deception, Mason sects, and help for the Christians of all the world. Well, some of the claims are quite opposing, but the main message is that allegedly the main aim of the Jews is taking on the entire, dominating in the entire Christian world. So Jews are associated with socialist ideas as a way to mask the main aim and the main objectives of the Jews. In the period of 1922 and 1923, we still in Lithuania live in a democratic period. But we see the formation of another tendency to associate the Jews with the opposing political forces and ideologies. And we have this conservative pro-Lithuanian position by saying that the pro-Lithuanian position is the right one, the correct one, and all the opposing powers are incorrect and have to be avoided. So this strengthens the distance between Lithuanians and others. I would like to quote Darbininkas publication, which was a very widespread newspaper in Lithuania. Darbininkas was published by Christian Democrats with a clear conservative undertone. I would like to quote an article in the Seimas. The bloc of the Jewish Social Democrats is doing nothing, so we should not consider it to be the efforts or the endeavors of the parliament. The Jewish were considered the negative component in the parliament. Another interesting tendency can be seen in 1939, when opposition can be seen to nationalists and Antanas Smetonas, which is widely criticized. During the occupation of the Klaipėda region and the smuggling of the press from the Klaipėda region, and the idea there was quite clear. We have to have strong attitudes and think about replacing Smetona's authorities and power because they were too pro-Jewish. And Smetona was shown as pro-Jewish because allegedly he had property in Palestine. This was a tradition of dissociation of different political powers and association with Jewish. In 23-24, the Zionist topic was very evident. And we can see that the Jews are discussed as cultivating and fostering their national identity. And this was presented as the exploitation of Lithuanians. The Jewish were presented as people thinking about their further life in Palestine and taking Lithuania only as a transition point, and saying that the Jews care not only about the welfare of Lithuania, but rather of Palestine. There's a negative attitude towards Jewish Zionists among some neutral attitudes. For example, 50 Jews from Kaunas left to Palestine, I quote. But next week, a larger number of Jewish are to leave for Palestine. And the context shows that Lithuanians feel some kind of relief that the Jews are leaving for Palestine. One more moment or aspect that can be seen is showing the importance of Lithuanian endeavors and efforts. And the quotation from 22-23, when presenting the
Tai yra, žydų sąmokslas, žydų inicijuota bolševikų.
The conspiracy of the Jews, the author very courageously says that Jews should understand that Lithuanians are not stupid Russians, and Lithuanians will not allow to be abused like Trotsky and others. This was a very belligerent attitude by showing the superiority of Lithuanians, but the common denominator is the same. By claiming that all the developments in Russia are orchestrated by the Jewish. There were also separate books that were published to discuss the problems of relations between Lithuanians and Jews, claiming that the Jewish morale allegedly is in conflict with the Lithuanian state. We can claim that anti-Semitism and similar attitudes were among uneducated people, but in 1906, a book was published about Lithuanians, dwarfs, and heroes, and claim that socialist ideas were born in the Jewish communities. That they are the way for the Jews to come into power. And the last book that I want to mention is The Jews and the Revolution, without the date of publication and the place of publication. And we can understand that this was published in 1920s, quoting Valančius, Kudirka, Schopenhauer. This publication was exceptional by its content and its form, and actually I analyzed a lot of publications of the time, but they lacked some visual materials. But this publication is very much adorned with illustrations and caricatures and paintings, and the message can be perceived through those caricatures. I would like to quote several points from that book. The Jews are on the top of socialists, and they kill Christians. Last year, a Jew killed a Christian. Or, for example, a Jewish soldier killed a Lithuanian. Jewish Bolsheviks were preparing for the revolution at the dawn of the Lithuanian statehood. This was a very popular cliche that was used when speaking about some shocking factors with the underlining that, for example, Jewish killed Lithuanian. There is another important configuration here, that the Lithuanian was being deceived by the communists. But later on, he changed his mind. Lithuanians were considered people who can make mistakes and then can change their mind. The book also describes the development in Russia, the Russian Revolution, Bolshevik powers, and also killing of innocent civilians. But at the same time, it says that capitalists were not affected by the Bolshevism. So, as you can see, two opposing stereotypes are being united. Another quote is that Jewish from Odessa killed several soldiers. This book is gives quite a primitive narration. And the book proposes such a view that Trotsky was Jewish, and that the book also presents Lenin, who is a Russian but has sold his soul to the Jewish. He is seen as a destructive element who says that you can use your Jewish identity. If you fail to do it, you can use your Russian identity. So on this note, I would like to finish my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
This concludes the formal part of this conference. I want to thank all of the speakers again. I want to thank the Seimas, all of the honorable members of parliament who participated in this, Faina, Kukliansky, and others who have made this possible. Thank you all for coming. I want to say one thing before we get to questions, if anyone has them, which is this. In the diary of Yitzhak Rudashevsky that has been mentioned several times throughout this conference, the idea of culture as a positive value, as something to strive for, as something that is also universal, has been brought up. And another name that has been mentioned one or two times in this conference is that of Antanas Ulpis, a man, a Lithuanian man, not Jewish, who did not know Hebrew or Yiddish, who nevertheless risked his life, as Rabbi Baker pointed out, and as others have said, risked his life to save these Jewish documents and books from extinction by the Soviets in 1948. He did so with no motive other than to save the culture that Yitzhak Rudashevsky was pleading for in his diary. He did so with no knowledge of what was going to become of these materials that he hid in the Church of St. George. And I just would like to take this opportunity today in the Seimas to announce that the YIVO institution in New York, in cooperation with the National Library of Lithuania, is going to establish a humanitarian award in the name of Antanas Ulpis for a Lithuanian scholar, teacher, archivist, journalist, political leader who has worked to save Jewish memory, preserve Jewish heritage in Lithuania. We are very, very proud and pleased to have signed a letter of agreement with the National Library just yesterday. And we hope that the first prize will be given in 2005. And you will all be updated with news of that in the future. Now, if there are any questions for any of the panelists who are still here, we would be happy to take those questions or comments. In light of total unanimous approval and agreement with everything that was said, this conference is now concluded. Thank you so much. Yes, I know. Yes.